I'm here in Dayton, Ohio, a city that is historically riddled with cases of redlining. I'm here in the neighborhood of Miami Chapel because I think it is both an interesting and an accessible example that can help show the history and causes of redlining and the impacts that can still be felt to this day. Redlining itself is a system where banks refuse certain loans to certain areas, like this one, because they are deemed a risk because of specific factors. These factors were mainly based on the applicant's ethnicity and financial status. For example, in New York City from World War II to 1955, the New York City Housing Authority constructed 20 large unsubsidized housing projects for white middle-class families. The authority maintained a list of 21 disqualifying factors for prospective tenants. Just a couple of these factors are listed on the screen right now. All of these factors would disqualify you for qualifying for one of these housing developments. Other cities at the time had similar programs like Boston. These housing requirements were made so only specific people could qualify. People that the local housing authority and local neighbors deemed acceptable. And when people of color were even suggested to be let in anywhere near these neighborhoods, racial hatred was stirred up and white people would riot.
Welcome to Grappling with Discrimination. A good example of stirred racial hatred would be Detroit in 1941, where the Sojourner Truth homes were proposed as a housing complex for African Americans, so they could work at a bomber plant. The complex was met with criticism that property values would decline, and the government relented to make the complex white only. Then the government suggested a different location, further away from the neighborhood, in an industrial neighborhood that was deemed not suitable for whites. But even this location was deemed too close to white people for the neighborhood. So white people rioted, leading to 100 arrests, in which all but 3 were African American, and 38 hospitalizations, in which all but 5 were African American. Examples like these are quite numerous and paint a clear picture that even in the North, and even during FDR's New Deal programs that built tons of housing, it was always meant for and has always benefited well-off white people. And even when development projects were meant to be built for people of color, white people would riot and push them to slums with industrial air quality, impacting the residents' health. In this video, we will grapple with this history and what can be done to fix it. This system of redlining mainly started during FDR's New Deal programs. There was a massive housing shortage during the Depression, and only the rich could afford to purchase homes or rent new apartments. World War II exacerbated the shortage, given that all construction materials were given to the military. In response to this housing shortage, FDR passed the nation's first civilian public housing programs. But in order to get any programs through the Dixiecrat South, programs were split on race, or excluded people of color entirely, pushing these people into the worst, unhealthiest parts of cities. In 1937, Congress passed the USHA, or United States Housing Authority, which claimed to respect existing neighborhoods' racial characteristics, while in actuality it rarely followed this claim, and often built many housing complexes specifically segregated, meant purely for certain racial groups. And like all separate but equal programs, they may have been separate, but they most certainly were not equal. For example, the first USHA housing projects were built in Austin, Texas, due to its aggressive promotion by its little-known congressman, Lyndon B. Johnson. Segregated projects were built for African Americans in East Austin's black neighborhood, and for whites on the west side. The projects created a much more rigid segregation than had previously existed. Eventually, city planners advanced a proposal that shifted African Americans scattered throughout the city to a single east side ghetto, labeled Rosewood Court. These projects were built on top of Emancipation Park, which was the site of an annual festival celebrating the abolition of slavery. Residents protested this seizure of land that was of great importance to the African American community, but were mainly ignored, and the park was demolished to build the projects. Now, the New Deal programs alone can't be blamed for the system of segregation that still lasts to this day, but it certainly is true if it wasn't for these purposely unequal, divided programs, it would not have been as extreme. This is not a condemnation of the housing programs itself, but rather the segregation within them. Mixed housing developments were built and did exist, but most of these housing projects were built with a specific racial bias in mind. After the war, when private housing projects were built and suburbia started to sprawl, Banks would only give loans to people in certain areas who met their specific racial and economic qualifications. This led to the process of white flight, a system in which white people would leave cities for suburbia in order to avoid integration, and in order to take advantage of these banking loans that they could qualify for. This led to a system in which people of color were stuck in areas and could not purchase homes because no banks would loan to them, preventing them from gaining the ability to generate generational wealth. People of color would be in the worst slums, with the worst air quality, leading to a system in which people of color have much worse asthma and other health defects than other groups. The refusal to loan money to neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous to banks has led to a system in which people of color have been put at a disadvantage that is hard to escape from, and has led to a system of de jure segregation that still exists to this day. So how do we solve this problem? The existence of black ghettos are a visible reminder of our society's inequalities and history. It's a reminder of implications that are so uncomfortable that we find ways to avoid them. After nearly a century of de jure segregation, the divide within the country runs deep. And the only way to solve this is to promote policies focused on integration of these communities. The 1968 Fair Housing Act legally prevents banning a person based on their race from renting or owning a location. But the current system's divides run so deep that we must make programs focused on integration to overcome this clear housing divide. Segregation helps no one and leads to a system in which our children don't understand people of different backgrounds because they haven't had the opportunity to interact with them. The lack of interactions with people outside your own group leads to an increase in discrimination because you hold a caricature of other groups instead of actually humanizing others.